Often, in planning our symposia, the Center's outstanding assistant directors and I can effectively develop a sequence of topics and identify the scholars we should tap to join the roster of speakers. This time, however, we could not possibly have put together the program without the coaching of Linda Ferber. Linda has been a treasured colleague throughout the Center's first 10 years, serving on the advisory committee and also as a member of the jury for our book prize. But this year, she outdid herself, giving us just the advice and contacts we needed to develop a roster of speakers whose presentations we expect will build on one another's to weave a rich tapestry about the history of collecting American art from the days of the early Republic into the early decades of the 20th century. For most of you, Linda needs no introduction. She is the senior art historian and museum director emerita of the New York Historical Society, where from 2005 until 2013, she served as vice president and museum director. Prior to that, Linda was Andrew Mellon Curator of American Art at the Brooklyn Museum, where she was also chief curator during a long and productive tenure over several decades, from 1970 to 2005, during which time she received her PhD from Columbia University. Among the many, many honors Linda has been awarded are the Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for Scholarly Excellence from the Archives of American Art in 2002, and in 2010, the Henry Allen Moe Prize for Catalogs of Distinction in the Arts for her book, The Hudson River School, Nature and the American Vision, an exhibition that still travels. She has organized exhibitions, published, taught, and lectured widely on a variety of topics in American art history, including William Trost Richards, the American Pre-Raphaelites, the American Watercolor Movement, the Eight, the Ashcan School, Albert Bierstadt, Asher Durand, the Hudson River School, and I could go on and on. At the New York Historical Society, Linda launched Sharing an American Treasure, a highly successful traveling exhibition program drawn from the Society's own rich collections. She also oversaw the reopening of the museum's conservation lab, and in 2011, she organized with guest curator and speaker at our symposium, Barbara Galati, the traveling exhibition Making American Taste, Narrative for a New Democracy. And 2 years later, her exhibition and publication, The Coast and Sea, Marine and Maritime Art in America, traveled to 5 venues. While Linda still maintains her association with the Society as senior art historian, she is also very active, I don't know where she finds the time, as an independent curator and art historian, having recently served as guest curator and volume editor for Impressionism, American Gardens on Canvas at the New York Botanical Garden. She's currently at work on an exhibition and publication about American Pre-Raphaelites that will open at the National Gallery of Art in 2019. But for today, Linda has taken time out to frame the issues for our symposium as our keynote speaker, presenting her thoughts on collecting American art, building a national narrative. So now, as I ask you to welcome Linda, I also would like to ask you to silence your cell phones so that we can hear her without interruption. Please welcome Linda Ferber.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Inga, for that wonderful introduction. I'm putting my cough drops over here. Excuse me if I have to use them during the course of this presentation. It's very thrilling. I have been at the table very happily and with great pride of the Advisory Council since the center began, and I was completely thrilled when Inga asked me to work with them on organizing a symposium on the collecting of American art, and so, as these things happen, here we are. And I was even more honored to be asked to give a keynote, which I will now proceed to do. And you can see my title, Collecting American Art, Building a National Narrative. And these signature works, let's go to the next. Now I'm going to do this. Hopefully I'm going to do it pointing in the right direction. Okay, the right side, right? It's not advancing. Okay. We'll keep trying. Is it not on?
It should be on.
Yeah.
It should go with this guy. Yeah.
Okay.
Is the pointer working? Yes, the pointer's working, so the battery's on.
Should we try this one?
Yes, I think you have to, yes, there you go.
There we go.
I'm going to put this down here so you don't
Okay.
get confused.
Thank you. Okay. So this screen with the oxbow, Cole's oxbow and Whistler's, well, I just call it falling rocket, will be my sort of screen during which they are the signature works, as all of you know, on the program, and they're perfect. And they're also very good to look at while I outline our claims today. Through the courtesy of my fellow presenters, the keynote speaker has had the privilege of previewing the papers which we will hear today and tomorrow. Distinguished art historians are investigating the 19th century collecting enterprise in America, and a conversation with a remarkable collector of American art will conclude the program tomorrow. This symposium offers a welcome opportunity to reflect on historic effects and historic efforts by individuals and organizations to build collections of American art, private, public, and quasi-public. What were American collecting practices? Are these papers as discrete and specific as the individual collectors whose tastes and agendas they document? Or might we discern certain patterns of common intent? If so, can we claim that these patterns might reveal an ambition to build, as I've called in my title, a national narrative? And if so, what might that narrative be? May we speculate that these individuals, agents, and institutions were engaged to differing degrees in a search for national and cultural identity by assembling a visual art patrimony? It's been illuminating to see the degrees of connectivity between topics. This preview has enabled a bit of brainstorming on my part. And so in the keynote, I'm inviting the audience and the speakers to ponder a few of the larger questions suggested by these investigations of individual collecting enterprises, from Robert Gilmore Jr., who was a patron of Cole's, who was born in 1774, to Samuel Untermeyer, the purchaser of Whistler's Nocturne in Black and Gold, who died in 1940. What indeed is the distinction between a patron and a collector? Even more important for the claim of a national narrative is the question of whether collections were ultimately dispersed or deposited. We will consider the tastes and agendas of individual collectors as well as the collective patronage of organizations and clubs. Our speakers will also consider the infrastructure that supported and shaped the practice of collecting in America, dealers as well as institutions. We will focus as well on the producers and purveyors of fakes, a collector-driven reality of the marketplace not usually discussed in polite society. So, in different ways and from diverse points of view, these topics will speak to the cultural nationalism that sometimes informed the enterprise of collecting American art, the idea of building a national narrative. We will learn that forming a collection of American art was perceived by some as an act that gratified individual taste and social ambition, to be sure, while also contributing to a higher collective purpose. I'm confident that these papers, individually and together, will add a fresh dimension to our understanding of the American collector and the American artist, as well as the world they inhabited at the busy intersection of 19th century history, culture, and commerce. In these 10 papers, we have a stimulating, though highly synoptic, overview of 19th century collectors and collecting practices. At the risk of being reductive in my broadly brushed chronology, the keynote now presents what I'll call a quick flyover to warm us up for the papers that we'll hear shortly and tomorrow. God willing. There we go. Lance Humphreys and Elizabeth Kornhauser will address the careers of both Robert Gilmore Jr. and Daniel Wadsworth. They were, of course, educated gentlemen with inherited wealth, who we may call American aristocrats, and they represent the old school collectors of the federal period. In contrast, Luman Reed and Jonathan Sturgis were self-made middle-class businessmen, merchants with a vision of American art as a national patrimony, to be realized for a short time in the New York Gallery of Fine Arts, established in 1844, and Margaret Laster will explore that enterprise. Kimberly Orcutt will let us know that the 1840s also witnessed the powerful, though brief, ascendance of the American Art Union, also run by New York businessmen, a membership organization whose mission was not only to promote contemporary American art, but also to affirm every citizen as a collector. Crowds are gathered here for the 1847 distribution of prizes. I checked the Broadway Tabernacle, and it accommodated 2,400 people, and it certainly looks like a full house. Sarah Cash will discuss the collecting enterprise of William Wilson Corcoran. He embarked on this at a difficult time. The national crisis of the Civil War and Reconstruction dampened, but did not dissuade his collecting mission set in Washington, D.C. He was a Southern sympathizer, but nevertheless, he went forward with plans to build his eponymous museum in the capital of the Union. He also left town during the course of the war and directed the project from abroad. Elizabeth Kornhauser will address Connecticut collectors. Elizabeth Hart Jarvis Colt was a staunch supporter of the Union cause. An industrialist, as Betsy calls her, Colt oversaw the firearms industry, founded at Hartford by her late husband. She also commissioned American landscapes for the gallery she built at their estate, Armsmere. Sophie Linford will unpack the mission of the American Pre-Raphaelites. Early in 1863, the American Pre-Raphaelites, led by Thomas Charles Farrar, whom you see here, organized in New York as radical reformers. Their works and their campaign are little known today. Nevertheless, their short-lived movement drew patronage and support from important figures like Charles Eliot Norton, also a reformer, who would be the founder of the discipline of art history in America. Madeline Beaufort addresses Samuel Putnam Avery, who I think somehow is kind of the Zelig of the second half of the 19th century collecting world in New York. Post-war wealth fueled the so-called Gilded Age, when new fortunes and social ambitions were the engines driving the collecting of both European and American art. Samuel P. Avery, whom you see here, was an omnipresent figure in this collecting world, acting as agent, negotiator, and confidant for collectors and artists alike. And this is a wonderful, it's actually about the size of a calling card. And it's the trade card for his gallery, which shows that he sold not only paintings, but also tchotchkes. Late 19th century nostalgia also sparked collector interest in earlier periods of American art, especially portraits of the founding fathers. A collector of contemporary European and American painting, or even a collector of old masters, like Mr. Frick, could desire such a patrimonial purchase to anchor a collection. We learned from Rick Saunders that this taste also proved to be a catalyst for the production of faked colonial and federal portraits. Jay Cantor will discuss the gentlemen's clubs that flourished during this period. The Century, shown here, along with the Union League Club and the Lotus Club, staged temporary exhibitions of works for sale that functioned as genteel marketplaces, bringing together ambitious artists and an elite clientele. And finally, Samuel Untermeyer will be addressed by Barbara Galati. Cosmopolitan collectors, and he certainly looks it here, like this distinguished New York jurist, acquired both American and European works. In Untermeyer's case, also antiquities and the decorative arts. He purchased Whistler's notorious nocturne in black and gold, The Falling Rocket, from the artist in 1892. I think you'll agree that this is quite a lineup. Now, to further unpack a bit my grand claim in the Keynote subtitle, Building a National Narrative. What role might the drive to establish national and cultural identity have played during the 19th century as an incentive for American collectors to create what I've called a visual patrimony? In truth, such historical self-consciousness pervaded American rhetoric from the time of the founders. A new continent, a new nation, a new form of government. Historical consciousness is certainly reflected in the names of early artist organizations, names that signal national identity. The Columbianum, the American Academy of Fine Art, the National Academy of Design. It's not unrealistic, then, to speculate that such ideas captivated many thoughtful citizens, including collectors, who wished to perceive their efforts as part of a larger national project, who wished to understand their cultural endeavors as markers of national progress. And Americans were also keen to refute and challenge European assumptions of cultural superiority. I'd want to explore three phenomena that I think both signaled and promoted such historic self-awareness. The first is in the ambitious and sometimes overly optimistic early efforts at institution building. It's been analyzed so perceptively by Alan Wallach and is represented here in several of our papers. Second, I call your attention to the prompt appearance early in the 19th century of published chronicles and histories of American art. And last, the recurrent staging throughout the 19th century of temporary exhibitions organized as public performances of art history as American history. So several of our papers, as I said, address what I'll call institution builders. Here we have Daniel Wadsworth and his marvelous Athenaeum, designed by Alexander Jackson Davis and Ithiel Town. The Athenaeum housed his own collections and eventually drew those of others. In 1905, Elizabeth Colt's collections would be deposited at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. The building may have been larger then. You'll learn that from Betsy's presentation. It's nice to build a wing when you get a great collection. Or if you build a wing, you may get a great collection. It works both ways. Others also deposited works of singular importance in pre-existing institutions. The names of Luman Reed and that of his partner and fellow collector, Jonathan Sturgis, live on because Reed's dream of a public collection was realized by his partner and others, first in the short-lived New York Gallery of the Fine Arts that I've already mentioned. After a number of temporary display venues, the collection of the New York Gallery of Fine Arts was deposited permanently at the new purpose-built building that you see here of the venerable New York Historical Society upon its completion in 1857. Corcoran, like Wadsworth, had attained collector immortality by founding an eponymous museum. Museums, athenaeums, and societies afforded public access to collections and collector as donor acknowledgement. They also promised a kind of cultural perpetual care for collections. As important, museums are also primary instruments for canon building. We should reflect on the fact that 20th century histories of American art have been written chiefly from museum collections established in the 19th century. While such survey publications are rather out of fashion now, we nevertheless recognize that those publications, compiled at the turn of the 19th and during the 20th century, have largely shaped the study of the history of American art, as well as the canon of historical American painting, I should say art, up to World War II. This brings us to the second signal of historical self-consciousness, the early appearance of chronicles and histories of American art, considered here in three seminal publications. Of course, we begin with the American Vasari, William Dunlap's History of the Rise and Progress of the Arts of Design in the United States, published in 2 volumes in 1834. His title is a bold claim for a nation barely half a century old, but it leaves no doubt about his mission as a patriot historian. Dunlap, who was an artist himself, chronicled a span from the beginning of the 18th century to the early careers of William Sidney Mount and Thomas Cole. The conclusion of Volume 2, interestingly, also addresses collections of pictures in America. It's wonderful to look at material that you've looked at before through a new lens, and mine has been totally collector-centric, and it's been very interesting to see what emerges. Dunlap begins with John Smibert's collection as an early example, and anecdotally surveys the field to his own time, listing the holdings of Robert Gilmore and mentioning the collections of many others. Special tribute is accorded to those like Lewin Reed, who collected the work of living American artists. Next up is Henry Tuckerman's 1867 Book of the Artists, in which the text is divided between a retrospective view modeled on Dunlap and several hundred pages packed with information about contemporary production in the antebellum period and the years immediately after the Civil War. Tuckerman, who was a critic and essayist, cautiously applauded the appearance of new patrons with new money. He was also attentive to collectors, documenting not only the production of an artist, but often mentioning who owned the works. His index lists a number of the collectors in our own universe here today and tomorrow. He mentioned Gilmore and Reed, of course, by then both deceased, Sturgis and Mrs. Colt. A lengthy appendix lists the collection highlights of Wadsworth Gallery, Corcoran's collection, and the New York Historical Society. These and many others are all organized in the appendix by city. A number of art historical surveys were published at the turn of the century. Samuel Isham's volume on the history of American painting of 1905 is preeminent among these, providing, as Elizabeth Johns has noted, the general model for subsequent efforts. Isham's highly organized and systematic textbook approach introduced a new level of periodization, organizing matter chronologically and thematically into 28 chapters, supported by an annotated bibliography. Perhaps most important, the 573-page text was the first to be richly illustrated with a dozen photogravures and 121 photographs. Almost all of these are from museum collections, especially from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Gilbert Stuart's Gibbs Channing portrait of Washington served as the frontispiece. You see him peeking through the veil of the tissue there. So here he assumes, as the frontispiece, a patrimonial role as the father of American art. The American Survey on the Wall. My third manifestation of art historical self-consciousness is the Survey exhibition, organized as a venue for the public performance of art history as American history, and vice versa. One successful endeavor in 1872 that cast a long look back at the history of America and American art was the so-called First Chronological Exhibition of American Art, the brainchild of a man named John Mackay Falconer. I'll close my remarks with a look at this little-known collector of American art, who was the driving force in the organization of a landmark survey loan exhibition, complete with illustrated and annotated catalogs. This is a carte de visite of Falconer, who was born in Scotland and educated at the high school in Edinburgh. He came to New York in 1836. He spent his working life in the hardware and houseware business. He moved to Brooklyn in 1857 with his mother and siblings and commuted to business in New York via the ferry. Falconer was also deeply involved in the art life of both cities for almost 7 decades. Never marrying, his energies beyond business were devoted to a myriad of art organizations, sketch clubs, academies, associations, philanthropies, societies, and art union. He even peddled subscriptions for the crayon. All of this provided perhaps a compensation for his commercial livelihood. Falconer, as you can see here, was also a skilled amateur artist and a printmaker, as well as a dedicated collector of American art who built an extensive art library. Although his interest in fine art, he told William Sidney Mount, was tabooed and grudged at his place of business, nevertheless, financial success enabled Falconer to collect art steadily from the late 1840s on. Today, John Mackay Falconer's profile as a collector of American art is elusive, if not nil. He is most often mentioned as a dedicated amateur artist, of course reinforced by his employment in the carte de visite, but not as an art collector per se. And yet, Falconer's personal holdings of American oil paintings, watercolors, drawings, and prints were dispersed after his death at 82 in March 1903 in an estate sale of some 669 lots. About half of them were Falconer's works, and the other half by some 60 American artists, as well as a selection of European works. Falconer also assembled two extraordinary libraries. One was sold in 1886, and the other in 1903, and you see the cover of the auction catalog for the 1903 sale here. These two sales comprised well over 1,000 volumes, art historical references, surveys, artist biographies, and dictionaries, as well as a full run of the crayon and all of Ruskin's works, collection and sale catalogs, and artist manuals, as well as antiquarian volumes, medieval manuscripts, hundreds of carte de visite photographs of American and European artists, and a collection of erotica. As is ironically so often the case, the fullest documentation of these remarkable holdings are the auction catalogs that were compiled just prior to their dispersal. My goal today is to offer a brief snapshot of Falconer's collection of American art. Without a doubt, the most famous work in Falconer's collection is Thomas Cole's The Titan's Goblet of 1833. He had purchased the painting by 1863. Interestingly enough, and this is where the connectivity begins to get interesting, Cole had sent The Titan's Goblet to Luman Reed on approval in 1833. But the subject did not appeal to his patron, so the artist sold it elsewhere. The Titan, not to Falconer. The Titan's Goblet was one of more than 20 oils and works on paper by Cole in Falconer's collection, along with a signed palette. As we will see, Falconer's devotion to the artist's family continued long after Cole's death in 1848. He seems to have met Cole sometime in the later 1840s, not sure where or how yet. As I said, Falconer himself was a skilled painter and printmaker. His oil study of Cole's studio signals that devotion, having been painted more than 30 years after Cole's death. And From the Shores of Brooklyn is one of his finest prints. You see the towers of the soon-to-be-completed Brooklyn Bridge rising in the left distance there. In a letter of 1856, nudging William Sidney Mount to begin this commission, Falconer confided, "Half the interest I have in my pictures are in the knowing of their authors. I have no ambition to form a large collection, but I wish a representation of the best of my friends." Seymour Joseph Guy's Evening, also a commission, is a record of Falconer's domestic life as well as of his collection. Falconer never married, but was head of household for a mother and siblings. Guy's portrait d'apparat depicts Catherine Falconer in a cozy corner, surrounded by John's collection that cover the walls of their house on St. Felix Street in Brooklyn. I'll show you a couple of details. We can see here, and the madness of all of this is that he was a good collector and he glazed everything. But Guy had as much fun with the reflections of the lamps in the glass as he had with the entire composition. And so you see the reflection of works on the other wall in works. I mean, it's very, very difficult to identify these. It's extremely tantalizing, nevertheless. And it signals a collection that was rapidly taking over the entire house. Well, let's go back to this. Falconer collected like an artist, by which I mean the works he collected were mostly, but not all, small in size. Some works, however, were commissions, like these two. Some were purchases, like the Titan's Goblet. And some represented artist exchange and tokens. The Liber Amicorae, offered in his sales, lots and lots of albums, attest to his participation in the sketch clubs, most likely his earliest entry into American Artist Society. Sadly, as we all know, most of these albums are disassembled once they enter the market. These scrapbooks, as well as hundreds of carte de visite photographs of artists, document a life of tireless networking and service to the artist community through benevolent organizations like the Artist Fund Society, of which he was a founder. Falconer was an indefatigable correspondent, and a couple of his long and newsy letters have been published in part. His account to Jasper Cropsey of Thomas Cole's death is well known. He was the only member of the artist community able to get to the funeral. The Hudson River had frozen over, but he went via the East River in train. He worked behind the scenes with the preparations for the 1848 memorial exhibition, as Cole had requested him to do. He assisted Noble in securing information for the artist's official biography. Over the ensuing years, Falconer helped Mrs. Cole buy back works, keep track of works, and authenticate works. The family was undoubtedly the source for many of Falconer's works by Cole, perhaps his wonderful juicy oil study of Salvatore sketching banditti. And I'm doing a naughty thing here, in that I'm totally distorting scale. But I just wanted to give you a closer look at Salvatore Rosa, since you've already seen the Titan's Goblet. Jasper Cropsey, the young Jasper Cropsey, shared the young Falconer's reverence for Cole in those early years, and the two artists were close. Janetta Falls is inscribed to Falconer as a gift from Cropsey for his support in Cropsey's decision to leave the practice of architecture for the life of a landscape painter. And one of my favorite details of this painting is the artist painting en plein air, you see tucked away. Maybe it's Falconer. But it certainly is a declaration, the ultimate declaration of the freedom of the life of a landscape painter, painting en plein air. Also supporting evidence of Cropsey's welcome within the Falconer family circle are these two I'll tell you how much you're seeing these magnified. These miniature landscapes were painted on calling cards. They're about this big. And they were given as Christmas tokens. They're signed on the back, one to Falconer and one to his sister. And I want to thank the Newington Cropsey Foundation and Ken Maddox for giving me access to these wonderful images of the Cropseys. Cole's strong influence on Cropsey is clearly evident in these two works, and it would have enhanced the attraction of his work, certainly for Falconer. And at his death, there were actually 28 works by Cropsey in Falconer's collection. Falconer's fondness, both for picturesque decay and for Scottish subjects, undoubtedly led him to acquire Cropsey's dramatic Doune Castle. It's a marvelous landscape. And he waited nearly a decade to secure a pendant for Doune Castle with a commission to William Hart, a fellow Scot. And you see here an 1851 study for Broughty Castle, Scotland, it's an unlocated painting. And I want to thank Gary Stiles, who is preparing a catalogue raisonné, for those of you who are interested, on William Hart. And I think he's actually here today if you want to speak to him. Falconer was also very fond of literary narratives, and this should stir the heart of Barbara Galati, who was my partner on doing our show on, what do we call it? Thank you, Making American Taste, Narrative Art for a New Democracy. The New York Historical Society's collection is filled with paintings like this, all gifts, from 19th century collections. I would suspect that the Met has a lot of them as well, but they don't see the walls very often. And we brought them out in force. And it was very interesting when a number of our colleagues wrote to us in appreciation, because they were able to bring their classes to see the paintings that flourished in the 19th century, but that are totally suppressed in our standard surveys of American art history. Falconer was especially fond of Shakespearean subjects. You see one here. These are perhaps the farthest from today's collecting tastes. It's a reach, but there he is. Falconer's interest in earlier American artists may have prompted his purchase of this magnificently sympathetic portrait by Waldo, Samuel Waldo, of a local character known as the Independent Beggar, who posed for him more than once. Falconer probably purchased the Waldo at the 1864 Metropolitan Fair's Pro Patria art sale. Now, there's only a very small sample here. Still to be located are works by Gifford, Kensett, Boughton, J.G. Brown, other works by Samuel Joseph Guy, Leutze, Thomas and Edward Moran, Worthington Whitridge, and others, all suggesting that this is a collection and a collector worth investigating. My heart will sing when I can call up his name and profile in the marvelous Center database. It may happen. But now I want to step outside the traditional definition of the private collection to argue here that Falconer's finest moment as a collector of American art was not private, but public, and of short duration, an enterprise wholly dedicated to creating an American narrative, whose name he undoubtedly suggested, the first chronological exhibition of American art. This large exhibition of some 250 paintings by artists ranging in date from John Smibert to John F. Kensett was displayed in 1872 at the recently completed Brooklyn Art Association that you see here. All were loans from private and public collections in Brooklyn, New York, Philadelphia, New Haven, Ipswich, and Boston. Falconer himself loaned 20 works, none of them by his own hand. The organizers, led by Falconer, sought to relocate the experience of art historical consciousness from the private realm of the survey text or the domestic gallery to the public arena of didactic spectacle. The response was impressive if we judge from the sustained press coverage and some 20,000 visitors to the exhibition during a 4-week run. 3,000 copies of the catalog, richly annotated by Falconer, were sold the first week. The New York Daily Tribune reported, and I quote, "We Brooklynites relish this. Decidedly, we must cross the East River if we want to see how public interest can be attracted and secured for art enterprises crowded by visitors." There's an extraordinary survival involved here. There was a standard catalog. That's the one that 3,000 copies were sold of. But there was also something called the Deluxe Commemorative Catalog. And it was a series of 13 remarkable photographs of the actual installation, along with the catalog of the exhibition, the list of works included. Now, chronological was the proud claim of the exhibition, but photographs of the installation look more like a Wunderkammer, anything but chronological as we understand it. You'll see lots of works you know. These crowded walls comprise a kind of art historical Where's Waldo? And it's great fun to sort of trace out the paintings for ones that you recognize. You can do that. You can just put on your slippers, and some night when you have nothing to do, you can call up the images of the Deluxe Commemorative Catalog, now online at the Brooklyn Museum Library website. And a careful study of the installation actually does reveal multiple threads, some historic, some art historical. For example, and I know this is Falconer's hand at work, there are many portraits of artists sort of laced throughout the installation, as well as portraits of Dunlap and Tuckerman, whose volumes Falconer surely mined for this project. And as you can see, they secured the loans of a significant number of already iconic paintings. The opening image, this is, as you can see, plate 1, announces a national narrative and an art history lesson. Smibert's Bermuda Party of 1729 is the largest picture, dominates the view, and dead center is Rembrandt Peale's Pater Patriae portrait of Washington presiding. Plate 2, the same theme. the Lansdowne portrait of Washington that was then in a Brooklyn private collection and now in the Brooklyn Museum. And over the doorways, two of Charles Willson Peele's portraits, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Facing off at the other end of the gallery was Washington's Trumbull at the Battle of Trenton. And I love this juxtaposition because the Trumbull is flanked by Sanford Gifford's Tivoli on the left and Jervis McEntee's, and note this, American collectors, still unlocated, large painting, the Ashokan Woods. So we have the founder flanked by an old world and a new world landscape. It's a similar motif that had been used at the Metropolitan Fair. Yale was an especially generous lender from the Trumbull collection, including not only this work, but 60 of the miniature portraits that record the generation of the Revolution. So founding fathers abounded. And I call your attention to Trumbull's self-portrait, looking rather dourly down toward his Washington portrait that is tucked up in the upper right. Falconer also secured the loan from Mrs. Thomas Cole of Cole's last allegorical series, The Pilgrim of the Cross and The Pilgrim of the World, which had been left unfinished at his death in 1848, and to which many artists and cultural tourists made pilgrimages. Cole's studio was maintained as it was, and for decades, people found their way, not only artists. There's a wonderful article, I think it was in Scribner's, and it was in 1881, where the view that you saw, Falconer's painting of Thomas Cole's first studio, he also etched it so that it could be used as an illustration, opening an article called The Summer Haunts of American Artists. So they opened, in a sense, with Cole's studio. And it just reinforced the fact that the studio had become a destination. These paintings are unlocated today. And so it was quite a sensational art historical find when the two surviving commemorative catalogs, these albums, were discovered at the Brooklyn Historical Society and the Brooklyn Museum in the 1980s. And I show you here, as you can see, it's the largest painting on the wall. They're maddeningly difficult to see, but nevertheless, they give you an idea of the scale. They certainly give you an idea of the subject matter. And as you might guess, this is probably the Pilgrim of the World coming to the end of his journey and his just reward. Next is the Pilgrim of the Cross and the Pilgrim of the World. I think you can read it here, setting out on their respective journeys. You can sort of think the voyage of life. And the Pilgrim of the Cross being received into glory at the end of his journey. And I love this one because as Trumbull is tucked in the upper right corner looking down, here we have Copley's Moses Gill. And that's one of 8 portraits by John Singleton Copley that were loaned to the exhibition. The Brooklyn Eagle published a visit to Falconer in June 1891 when he looked, as he does here in this late photograph, and described a house filled with, quote, so many pictures that they literally cover the walls from wainscot to ceiling. They form an epitome of American art down to war times and include notable specimens of the work of Cole, Mount, Cropsey, Guy, Kensett, Hall, Gifford, Johnson, Brown, and other fathers of painting. I think that evidence is available, surely, to reconstruct both Falconer's private collection as well as his public role as art impresario. And I will argue that both enterprises were informed by a desire to perform as a model American collector. We will hear of such collectors in today's and tomorrow's papers. Thank you.